Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Rice University's Baker Institute for this timely and informative event on political Islam post-Arab Spring. I would like to thank Dr. Kadir Yildirim, our newest research scholar at the Baker Institute Center for Middle East, for organizing this evening's event and bringing together this distinguished panel of speakers. Kadir is studying democratization, political Islam, and political economy in both Turkey and the broader Middle East, and his research agenda covers key questions confronting U.S. policymakers concerning political Islam in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere. He is also collaborating with our other fellows and scholars in the Center for the Middle East, Mohammed Tabar on Iran, Christian Ulrichsen on the political economies of the Gulf and the Arab states, Marwa Shalabi on women's rights and political participation in the Middle East, and a new postdoctoral research fellow co-hosted with the Department of Political Science, Abdullah Aydagan. So as we've witnessed in this past weekend in Turkey, the AKP's electoral victory demonstrated the strength of Erdogan's Islamist party. Islamic political parties throughout the region have experienced both electoral victories and violent repression, but they represent an undeniable voice in Arab publics. The rise of these parties is part of a longer trend, one that the United States has struggled to address for over 2 decades. And from my vantage point as a former American diplomat back in 1992, as the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department, after the feast, the Islamic Radical Party won legislative elections in Algeria, I delivered a speech outlining the U.S. policy approach toward political Islam. Remember, this is 1992. And the reason I'm referring to this because some of the themes in that speech are relevant to this evening's discussion. And I look forward to this context from these experts that we brought together this evening. Let me just focus on one key part of that policy statement. We stated very clearly what the United States stood for and what it stood against toward political dynamics in the Middle East region. These are quotes. Those who are prepared to take specific steps toward free elections, creating independent judiciaries, promoting the rule of law, reducing restrictions on the press, respecting the rights of minorities, and guaranteeing individual rights will find us, the United States, ready to recognize and support their efforts, just as those moving in the opposite direction will find us ready to speak candidly and act accordingly. While we believe in the principle of one person, one vote, we do not support one person, one vote, one time. That was translated in the Arab press. I was trying to be incorporating the role of women in electoral politics. That was translated in the Arab press as one man, one vote, one time. We differ, again, the United States, we differ with those, regardless of their religion, who practice terrorism, oppress minorities, preach intolerance, or violate internationally accepted standards of conduct regarding human rights. We differ with those who are insensitive to the need for political pluralism, a very important concept. We differ with those who cloak their message in another brand of authoritarianism, with those who substitute religious and political confrontation for constructive engagement with the rest of the world, with those who do not share our commitment to peaceful resolution to conflict, especially the Arab-Israeli conflict, and finally with those who would pursue their goals through repression and violence. So these themes, with certain variations, were adopted in both Republican and Democratic administrations since then, and you certainly can hear echoes of them in President Obama's speech in Cairo in June 2009. So following the Arab uprisings and the subsequent triumphs and disasters of Islamist political parties throughout the region, it is more important than ever that the United States listen and understand the political forces at play in the Middle East in order to construct effective policies addressing the many issues and implications of political Islam. So it is in this overall context that the Baker Institute is hosting this event and program. And I look forward, as I know we all do, the conversation this evening. Dr. Kadir Yildirim will introduce our panel and moderate the discussion. Kadir.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you all for coming this evening. I don't have a lot to say other than introduce our speakers this evening. Just note the context in the sense that, the recent change, evolution in both Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the AKP in Turkey, and that's the occasion that gave rise to this panel this evening. Dr. Fevzi Bilgin, on the left, is the founding president of the Rethink Institute in Washington, D.C. His expertise is constitutional politics, Islamic politics, and Turkish politics. Dr. Bilgin previously taught political science in the United States and also in Turkey. He recently published 2 books. First one is Understanding Turkey's Kurdish Question, and the second book is Political Liberalism in Muslim Societies. Both great books. Dr. Bilgin is one of the leading scholars on Turkish politics in the United States. Dr. Nathan Brown, in the middle, is professor of political science and the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. His research is primarily focused on Islamist movements, Arab law and constitutionalism, Egyptian politics, and Palestinian politics. He's affiliated with a series of institutions. I'm not going to name all of them. Some among those are Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Human Rights Watch, American University in Cairo, United States Agency for International Development. He's most recently the author of When Victory is Not an Option, Islamist Movements in Arab Politics, as well as being the author of 5-6 other books, such as Between Religion and Politics, Resuming Arab Palestine, Constitutions in a Non-Constitutional World, and The Rule of Law in the Arab World. Dr. Brown is one of the leading scholars on Arab politics and Islamist parties. Moving on to the other leading scholar on Arab politics and Islamist parties, Dr. Gillian Schwedler is professor of political science at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. Her research focuses on questions of contentious politics, Islamist politics, and political dissent. She is the author of the award-winning book, Faith in Moderation, Islamist Parties in Jordan and Yemen. The substance is great, but the title, still to this day, it's unbeatable, Faith in Moderation. The book is about Islamist parties' moderation, but at the same time, it plays both ways. And she's also co-editor of Policing and Prisons in the Middle East with Leila Khalili. Dr. Schwedler is a current member of the editorial committee and former chair of the board of directors of the Middle East Research and Information Project. She is currently working and close to finishing a book manuscript on political protests and policing in Jordan from 1946 to the present. The format for tonight is we're going to give each of our speakers about 10-12 minutes to discuss their respective topic. Dr. Bilgin primarily will focus on AKP in Turkey, Dr. Nathan Brown on Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and Dr. Schwedler will focus on political Islam's recent trend, though these focuses will not be exclusive. They have free hand in overstepping their boundaries. And then we'll follow up with Q&A. You can sit here. It's up to you if you want to address here.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for kind introduction. Is it? All right. Okay. How is it now? Yeah, you hear me now? Okay. So, huh?
That's good.
All right. So yes, I'm going to talk about Turkey, and director and Kadir already mentioned that there was an election this Sunday, and it came out with a very surprising outcome. So I had to rewrite my paper. Okay. So I haven't done this before, but this really took everyone by surprise. I'm a political scientist by training, but I'm not the only one who basically made a big mistake in terms of predicting the outcome of this election. So, if this conference was held last week, I would come here and make a presentation about what went wrong with the AKP, right? But today I cannot do that because they won the election again with a huge margin that even they themselves are in shock right now, because they have been waiting. I mean, just some specifics about 42, 40, 43, 44% of the vote, which is a great number in Turkey because of the multi-party system, and because they have been facing so much challenges in the recent years, they have been isolated in the world, and so on and so forth. Things were going bad. And then they ended up getting 49 to 50%, basically recovering all their bases that they had done in their best times. Okay, so how to explain this? So this is my job today, and I have been thinking about this in the last 3 years. Okay, and this is a good venue to basically to launch that, to introduce that theory. It dawned on me that their AKP is winning election not because it's Islamist, it's winning because it's not Islamist, all right? And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. That goes against the grain of the whole theme, maybe, of the conference, okay? So it's kind of like an uncharted territory, and I have the greatest referees here who could correct me. Right, like much prominent Middle Eastern experts. So, we are, just a few more specifics. I don't know how familiar you are with the developments in Turkey. I'm sure you've heard of Erdogan and his adventures and so on. But in the last 3 years, things were really going bad, and that's why that would justify a title like "What Went Wrong with AKP." The rule of law eroded significantly. Police brutality became kind of like a commonplace in Turkey to suppress the dissent. Corruption scandals and investigations, maybe you've heard about that, that was rampant. Civil liberties really took a great damage in the last 2-3 years. Press freedom is almost like non-existent. 90% of the media is now catering to AKP government. So these things were happening, and then in the last June, there was another election, parliamentary election. Actually, the Sunday election was a snap election that happens in parliamentary democracies. AKP basically lost about 1/5 of its base, all right, and dropped to 40%. And people said that, wow, you see, you have been undermining democracy in Turkey and you were punished. You lost your parliamentary majority, okay? So you see, you have been using Islamist discourse, you have been, polarizing nation and so on, so you were punished. But then, after June elections, there were serious, very tragic terror attacks in Turkey, bombings in Ankara, maybe you've heard about that. And then the coalition talks between opposition parties failed. They couldn't coalesce against the AKP. And then AKP government de facto, governed the country until the next election, which was on November. And then they won big. So normally if you are an incumbent government and there are like serious terrorist incidents are happening during your rule, okay, you should lose some votes. Probably you should lose the government. That's what we know as political scientists, okay? That if things are going wrong during your rule, okay, you would lose your support. People will punish you, okay? But this is not happening. And people attribute this to the strength of the Islamist position of the AKP. And I would explain that this has nothing to do with Islamism. It's just brutal party politics and typical, authoritarian, tendencies and actions and policies that the autocrats learn from each other. So, AKP now is sort of like a pseudo-Islamist party, in my definition, is a neo-Ottoman, and it's catering anything that goes with or sympathize with conservative base, and it's also a hegemonic party. That's a technical definition where a party basically dominates the political scene and no other can compete with that. It's a hegemonic party, but they want to build more than that. They want to build a party state where state and party structure overlaps. And they want to put Erdogan on top of this. He is already on top of everything, but they want to solidify this, amend the constitution, and do it that way. So that could be interpreted as, wow, they are building an Islamic state and establishing Sharia and then, installing Erdogan as the caliph. It is interpreted that way, I hear that. But, from inside Turkey, it's not seen that way. Turkish people's support for Islamic State or Sharia is in the single digits. That's according to Pew Research. They don't know what Islamic law is, or they don't kind of associate with that. It's because of the secular culture that has been there for decades. But they love Erdogan because they think that he is like them. He is acting like them, talking like them, and then, conducting himself like themselves, apparently for half of the nation. So, but the AKP of 2000s, early 2000, in their first two terms, this is now fourth term, okay, in their first two terms, was not like that. It was a party of justice and development. This is their name, Justice and Development Party. They came to power by asserting that they will basically undo the injustices during the secular rule, okay? And they will basically launch a development program for Turkey so that, Turkey will come out a long hiatus of political and economic crisis. And they wanted to build a model, political and economic model that could be emulated by the countries in the region. Middle East, that's I'm talking about, all right? And in the first two terms, they got very close to this ideal. Turkey was looking great. 2010 by 2010, 2011, it was a growing country. It was loved by everybody. Everybody want to basically jump in the bandwagon and then be part of this growth. Economy was doing great. Politically, the country was in kind of harmony and so on. So what happened all of a sudden? How do you explain the shift? What happened to AKP leadership? Why kind of drifted into authoritarianism? There's a little bit of history to that, but I'm going to explain some of the factors that I think are the reasons, and these are very secular things. They are not religious stuff, okay? For example, Erdogan wanted to become president in 2007, Okay, he was prime minister, and he wanted to basically end his career at the top of the rank, president in Turkey. So Turkish military, which was kind of like very secularist and so on at the time, didn't allow him, actually threatened him with a coup if he attempts to. So he let his friend Abdullah Gül elected as president. So now these two are co-founders of the AKP. And Abdullah Gül is the more erudite brains of the party, and then Erdogan was more like an organizational. He has this organizational mind, right? So they were doing great together, kind of balancing each other. When Abdullah Gül left the politics, because president needs to be non-partisan as opposed to what Erdogan does at the moment, all right? So he left politics, he became president, okay? He was aloof of all the daily politics. The whole party basically left to Erdogan. And then he started to consolidate himself more and more, by purging some of the alternative leaders, even Gül's people over time. And then he basically dominated party in 3-4 years. This is really simple party politics. Like one leader goes, the other one basically takes over. So that's one thing that raised the profile of Erdogan over time. Second thing, the constitutional regime of Turkey changed, not on the constitution per se, but in reality, because of some of the trials where some like generals, officers, and so on were tried by the accusation of plotting against the government or plotting for coup d'etats, all right? So that really weakened the military's influence in politics and left a great void to be filled by Erdogan. And he happily filled that void and then basically remained as unchecked by any other power. So that's the second thing.
1 minute.
1 minute, okay. And the third thing is Arab Spring. So until Arab Spring, these guys were not using Islamist discourse, all right? Not so heavily. It was more of politics, more of providing people, benefits, social welfare, and so on and so forth. Arab Spring basically, first, it was initiated by more like secular demands in the beginning, but turned into some sort of like an Islamist party, festival because Islamist parties were more organized. They were in the business of opposition for a long time, so they took over. Yes, they took over. Nahda came to power in Tunisia. Muslim Brothers came to power in Egypt, and others were about to follow. So that excited AKP leadership. They think that now they can build something because they have also Islamist background. They can do something about this, and they start to cater to these new leaders. They want to build some sort of like an alliance under their leadership. Mursi was thinking that he could build a Muslim Brothers crescent, as like King Abdullah once mentioned. But Erdogan wanted to build an alliance under his leadership where kind of blended with some Islamism and so on, but eventually aiming more trade, more welfare, more prosperity to Turkey. So,
Time is up.
all right. So, so all these things, okay, just last 2 sentences. So all these things basically led to authoritarian drift. And all of these factors, I believe, cannot be explained by Islamism, okay? Is more of like a yearning for power, okay? That happens in every country, every society, every kind of like developing democracy. And a little bit kind of like an Oriental tradition, Turkish tradition of state, which is a very heavy, powerful state tradition, okay? Very thick bureaucracy. And priority of state over individual. These sort of traditions basically shaped up Erdogan as being a very successful politician, masterful politician. He just saw the demand, saw the voids, filled the voids, and took over. And then basically what we have is some sort of some semblance of democracy right now. where they are in power and they are unopposed at the moment, okay? And you don't know which direction they would take. It's basically in the hands of Erdogan to choose whether he would want to strengthen democracy of Turkey or he would want to go to another way.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Brown?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me down here. Unfortunately, for me, if I were to adopt the title, What Went Wrong, the problem would be that I would have too much to say about Egypt, and I would go long beyond my 12 minutes. And there's instructions which you can't see on the microphone, but I can see right in front of me. It says, speak naturally. And I'd probably stop speaking naturally if I were to express fully the frustration that I see when I look at Egyptian politics today. What I want to focus on, my remarks on, are on the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And in essence, the message that I want to leave is that the period from 2011, the Egyptian uprising, to 2013, when the Muslim Brotherhood was thrown out of political power, will be a turning point in the history of the movement, that the movement that we will see emerging today is simply fundamentally different, and its place in Egyptian politics will be fundamentally different than anything that we have seen in the past. There's a tendency when we look at the Brotherhood, I think, to press really hard. This is, okay, is this better? And I should still speak naturally. That's consistent. Okay, all right. There's a tendency to sort of say, you know, this is a movement that defines itself as a Muslim Brotherhood, as an ideological movement, and to look at their ideas. And every time I'm sort of pressed about examining a Brotherhood ideology, I go back to a conversation I had with a young Brotherhood member. This was some years ago, who was talking all kinds of sort of interesting and reformist ideas about the Brotherhood. And I asked him once, when he was talking to me this about some of his ideas, I said, what happens when you talk about these ideas with your fellow Brotherhood members? And he stops for a second, he looks confused, he says, ideas? In the Brotherhood, we don't talk about ideas. And what he meant was that this was an organization that was full, it wasn't necessarily full of intellectuals. Most of the intellectuals that we associate with sort of Brotherhood type thought are not actually members of the movement. It was a movement of doers, and it's an organization that is, in a sense, more an expression of an organization of tight bonds among its members, and an organization that has, in a sense, managed to reproduce itself more successfully than any non-state actor in modern Arab history. It has managed to reproduce itself over the years. It's much more an organization than an expression of any kind of ideas. If you want to understand the Brotherhood, you have to look an awful lot on the context in which it's operating, because its ideas are essentially to increase the role of Islam in public life, and that can push it in any different kind of direction. In the period, basically, I would say between the 1970s and 2011 or so, which I sort of want to concentrate on how the Brotherhood emerged during that period, and then talk about the post-2011 to 2013 period to show the contrast. In the period between the 1970s and 2011, the Brotherhood essentially picked itself up from a period in which it had been harshly suppressed, banned, and driven out of Egyptian public life, and managed to recreate itself as an organization in a different kind of political atmosphere. Egypt, from the Sadat years into the Mubarak years, was not the kind of tight one-party dictatorship that had emerged in Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s. It was a little bit looser. There was some room for free expression. There was some room for free organization. There were even periodic elections for parliament in which the opposition was invited to participate. And the basic fundamental rule of those elections, I like to summarize this as essentially saying to the opposition, you can run, you just can't win. And the Brotherhood took advantage of that opportunity. And the effect of this kind of semi-open environment, and remember, semi-open and, well, I would say 1/4 open and 3/4 closed environment, was essentially to cultivate two different streams of thought in the movement. I say thought, two different streams of action, keeping to my warning that the Brotherhood is not about ideas. Two different streams of action. There was one group who were, in a sense, politically oriented. Often these were people who had joined the Brotherhood after some association or experience with student government. Some of them had gone into professional association, the Doctors Association, the Bar Association, and so on, and had emerged in essentially a political environment. And their idea was sense that there were opportunities, even in this semi-open environment, that the Brotherhood could pursue its mission through greater participation in public life, and that these political opportunities were ones that were worth investing in. And there was another strain within the movement that was essentially much more cautious, much more focused on the organization and discipline and hierarchy within the organization itself, much more inclined to say to the politicians, you're thinking in terms of the electoral cycle, we're thinking in terms of generations. Our job is to sustain this organization and its mission that we inherited in difficult circumstances, and we aim to pass it on to the next generation so that it can slowly pursue its mission. And overinvestment in politics, over-challenging what is still an authoritarian regime, is just going to get us into trouble. And you could actually, I'm simplifying things greatly, but it didn't sound so simple sometimes when you would meet Brotherhood leaders, because you could tell right away which kind of orientation they belonged into. If somebody came into the room, walked into a room and started like glad-handing everybody, shaking everybody's hand, had a smile for everybody, remembered a personal detail about everybody. I remember meeting one of the sort of leading politicians of the movement who I hadn't seen in 5 years, and the first thing he says to me is, "Nathan, you lost weight, you look great." Which I will tell you, in Egypt, to say you lost weight, you look great is not a normal sentence. It's usually you lost weight, what's the matter? So he knew how to talk to an American, and he knew who I was, even though I'd met him twice, and this was 5 years before. That was one kind of orientation. And the other, the more common actually attitude among many of the leaders, was what I would consider to be a very shy and reserved sort of self-presentation. They were friendly enough. If you asked a direct question, you would get a direct answer, but there was none of kind of the glad-handing, how are you, how's the family, you look great kind of flattery. The second camp, the shy guys, were the ones who actually dominated the movement. But the political events were such that the politicians, in a sense, had some sway. Right prior to the 2011 uprising in Egypt, many of the politicians had been essentially shoved aside because the regime looked like it was clamping down. And what that meant was that when Egypt went into turmoil in 2011, the people who were controlling the movement were probably some of the less politically experienced people in the movement, and I think some of the mistakes that the movement made can perhaps be attributed to that fact. Between 2011 and 2013, the Brotherhood all of a sudden found itself in a position that they simply were not prepared for. And that they had to adjust to very, very quickly. The first parliamentary elections that were held were ones in which the Brotherhood was the largest party in parliament, and Islamist parties as a whole had a very considerable majority in the parliament. The Brotherhood decided to contest the presidency, probably one of the most fateful and difficult decisions the Brotherhood made, but they decided in the end to contest the presidency, and they won it in a very close election. And then in 2013, in the face of mass demonstrations and an army coup, the Brotherhood finally suddenly found itself thrown out of power, and not simply thrown out of power, but ruthlessly suppressed. Demonstrations in support of the ousted president, Mohamed Morsi, in August of 2013 were put down by security forces. There was something, the exact number of deaths is unknown, but perhaps a couple thousand were killed just in the month of August 2013. And there's been continued suppression of the movement, rooting Brotherhood supporters out of public life and political and positions in universities and the state bureaucracy and the judiciary and so forth and so on since that time. So now I come to the last 2 years, so that's a minute a year. Okay. That was then. This is now. How has the Brotherhood reacted to this? Well, in this past summer, I actually went to Istanbul, not to look at the AKP, I leave that to people who know more about it, but to talk to some of the Brotherhood people and Islamist supporters who've gathered there in exile. And I didn't recognize the movement. It was a very, very different set of conversations. Gone was the deference to older generation. You could tell this in the way they sat, the way they talked to each other. Gone was the conservatism. Gone was the interest in politics. One person says, anybody who talks about elections in this environment just sounds stupid. And up was talk about revolution, about the way in which the Brotherhood, or not just the Brotherhood, and that's important, Islamists in general were part of a revolutionary wave that was going to fight this abuse of power and authority and the way that people had of dominating each other and the entire system and the judiciary and the business sector and every single sector of Egyptian society had to be revolutionized, and old was out and youth was in, and I thought, I've been here before. I grew up right near the University of Washington campus in the late 60s and early 70s, and this was like a 60s generation. We're going to bring the whole system crashing down. And it was stunning because it was a movement that seems now very, very disorganized. It's throwing caution to the wind. I could no longer tell, much less who's a politician and who's kind of a more conservative organization person. I couldn't tell who was Brotherhood and who wasn't Brotherhood in this group. And it's a movement that historically has valued its own continuity as an organization, and the number of members who said, I'm going to do this whether the Brotherhood tells me or not, or whatever happens to the Brotherhood, it's the revolution that matters, was very, very striking. So
Time's almost up.
Okay, what I was going to say, this is not your grandfather's Brotherhood. It's not even your father's Brotherhood. It is, to me, a dangerous sign for Egyptian society that what looked to be happening perhaps very slowly before 2011 and then very quickly between 2011 and 2013 was the possibility of integrating Islamists as a normal political actor. That possibility has been crushed, I think, for a generation at least, and that what we're going to see in Egypt is a nasty struggle between a decentralized and a revolutionary movement that represents, my guess is, something like 20% of the society, but thinks it represents 55 or 60%, and a state apparatus that is showing its most ferocious face to that movement, but I think initial indications are that it will not have the sort of policy successes, especially in the economic realm, that would be necessary to sort of sell that kind of repression long term. So I wish I'd given my remarks backwards, because then I would have wound up with a happy ending. I think happy endings may come in Egyptian politics, but my guess is that it will be a generation before we can talk in more hopeful terms about political Islam as a normal political actor in Egypt.
Thank you. Dr. Schwedler?
Thank you. So I want to thank the organizers. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. And my fellow panelists, of course. I was asked to speak in broad strokes about the implications for political Islam in the region and some broader patterns. And I think it dovetails nicely on a lot of what has been said, but thankfully you didn't say everything that I wanted to say, which was always my concern when I speak last, that everything's been said. So one of the things I think to start with is to build immediately on Nathan's conversation, is that the uprisings in the last few years, it's easy to sort of have this sense that these groups have evolved in different kinds of ways. And from a little bit of a distance, they have evolved. But in other ways, if you take the case of Egypt, which he developed nicely, you always had these different voices, just sometimes certain voices were at the fore and sometimes other voices were at the fore. And so with the uprisings and with Morsi coming to power in Egypt, the progressive younger voices, the bloggers that were widely talked about, there were sort of people were optimistic, like, these are the liberal progressive Muslim Brotherhood, they left the party and other voices came to the fore. And now as we're speaking, another set of voices are coming to the fore. So that's really important when you think about a group that has a history going back to 1928. It's not a single set of institutions that has a life. It's different sets of individuals in different generations pushing and pulling in different directions. So that's one of the points I wanted to emphasize, is to not think of these groups as single as groups, but as groups that have these complicated dynamics. And then we can think, what are the contexts in which these dynamics are, different groups are coming to the fore. So when, not just in Egypt, throughout the region, there were possibility for Islamists to compete in elections, most of the parties in the region, most of the groups, whether they were legal political parties or not legal political parties, in many places like Egypt, they were not allowed to be legal, but they were there. Internal to those parties, you had debates. Should we participate in the elections? Should we not participate in the elections? And for the most part, we should try to participate when we have that opportunity. Won out. Now that's off the table. It's just not a possibility. So where do those voices go? Many of them are frustrated. Some of them have left those parties for other kind of initiatives, and I'll talk about one in Jordan in a second. But it's the broader context of what's possible that plays a significant role on how the parties play out internally in terms of what's possible, which voices come to the fore at which particular historic moment. And this is a particular historic moment where the more moderate voices are having a hard time holding on to much because they're panicky, the groups are being severely repressed in most places, but not in all places, and they're being shouted down, often quite literally, by others who say, they were never going to give us a chance to rule. They never were. We said that all along, and we had a chance to rule, and they didn't let us do it, right? So people that were advocating, and many of these are the people that we've known for decades and had, the most ready access to among these groups, although we've had pretty good access to the diverse range of voices. They're frustrated. They're sort of shut out. They're feeling alienated from their parties. They're frustrated, and yet the context in which they had participated isn't there anymore. There's not a chance to even have debates about running for elections. So it's this broader context which has changed things, and it's made it very inhospitable for any kind of more moderate voices. There's a widespread but not universal demonization of the Muslim Brotherhood. Egypt is front and center, but Saudi Arabia is very happy to ally with Egypt and say, look, this is what we're afraid of. And the effort is to draw connections with groups like ISIS or Iran or any other Islamic horror story you can imagine. The regimes are front and center in putting those images forward because it justifies their own repression of any voices. And it's already been said here by Nathan, it's not only Islamists that are being repressed. This is a point where all kinds of opposition voices are being shut down, including young liberal, secular voices. It's really a terrible moment for political dissent in the region. Some of these changes, the uprising, some of the developments afterwards, as I said, have brought many of these internal divisions front and center, and some parties have split. Some parties, older generations are shut out, younger generations are coming in. So you're seeing these different dynamics. There's not a single picture that's spread across the cases where a certain bloc is dominated, but to say all these parties are undergoing individually these stresses over what the party is going to be. So one case where that's very clearly illustrated, besides the one we have mentioned already, is in Jordan, which at least since 1989, when the Muslim Brotherhood, when the King Hussein called elections again after not having elections for several decades. In 1985, the Muslim Brotherhood and all political parties, they didn't run as political parties, but the political groups decided, are we going to run? And from 1989 and 1993 and subsequent elections, the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan was divided. Should we run or should we not run? And they self-described themselves as the moderates and or the doves and the hawks. That was that language they used internally. So I would be interviewing and they'd say, why are you talking to the hawks? Those guys are crazy. So they understood themselves to have different poles. With the repression of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, with this terrible environment for any sort of Muslim Brotherhood or moderate Islamic voices being repressed in the region in very many places, the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood, with this existing divide, has literally split, right? Where some are saying we have to sort of push back, we have to push back hard, we have to stop accommodating this regime, because this regime is never going to let us have any say. And, look at Egypt was another case. They never really let them have any say. So we need to stop this. We're committed to elections if we had a chance, but we're not really being given a chance. The system is being manipulated, so we're going to pull out. And the moderates that said, no, we're still committed. And so at the moment, right now, in the spring, one branch of the Muslim Brotherhood has re-registered the organization as a Jordanian charitable society under the name of the Muslim Brotherhood. The existing branch remains a charitable society as the Muslim Brotherhood, but with some ties to Egypt. And there's kind of a standoff about what the direction. There's a little more to it than that, but there's kind of a standoff. So that has literally been split in two over this question of what to do. But Jordan is one of the countries with Morocco, but it is not banned the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not repressed it. It's really kind of holding back. And I think part of the reason is because with all the turmoil in the region and the concern about ISIS to Jordan's north, there's a very strong concern of if we shut down everything, if we suppress all these voices, even the moderate voices, there will only be one place to go. And that's not necessarily ISIS, but it's to the more extremists. You're sort of giving the extremists, the voice to say, you're giving them justification to say, look, they won't let us participate at all. So you have this significant split with a certain percentage of the leadership in Jordan insisting to the monarchy, we stand with you, we stand with the Hashemites, we have no qualm with the monarchy per se, we simply want to have more power constitutionally, we want to be able to choose a prime minister, et cetera. So pushing the same language that they had been pushing for 2 decades. And another group that's trying to say, they're running away with the party, we're the real Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, so you're seeing that play out right now in Jordan. In Yemen, similarly, the Islah party, which has the Muslim Brotherhood in it, was always a sort of coalition party with other voices, Islamist voices, including some that we would consider jihadi voices. And that has basically also split between those who have decided we're going to still push for some kind of democratic participatory government and those who are siding with the sort of the transitional coalition. Of course, we have a civil war there now, so that has all sort of fallen apart. But you had these 2 voices, and those clusters of people, some of them continue to be there. Many of the moderates were killed. We don't know if they were assassination attempts or happenstance, but many of them have actually been killed and targeted in the past year. So Tunisia is an interesting case because in Tunisia, the Nahda party, which we consider the sort of Muslim Brotherhood-ish party, didn't have these kinds of, internal divides, and partly because it wasn't contending with the practical questions of politics in Tunisia, right? It was an exiled party under Ghannouchi in London, and if you wanted to be attached to that strand, you could. If you didn't, you went somewhere else. But it didn't have to contend with, are we going to run for elections or not? Where are we going to stand? Are we going to speak out against the government or not? Because it had just this general, we're exiled, a general critique. And so you didn't see that party split in the same kind of fractures because it wasn't contending with the same kinds of internal tensions over the years. So in broad sweeping terms, I think it's important to recognize that the parties continue, as we've said this for years, but they continue to be more a product of individual contexts than they are of any single political Islam is this or that or X or Y or Z, right? Each one has its very particular domestic contexts that shape it most significantly, and the histories most significantly, how much those regimes are repressive or not. But it still is true that on the whole, anything Islamist right now is seen with great suspicion by regimes in the region, right? So there's a serious cautiousness. And so that trend throughout the region, the spillover effect, I think is stronger now than it was in recent decades. So one of the last things I was asked to speak on, how much do I have?
About 2 more minutes.
Okay. So I'll try to do this quickly. So one of the last things I was asked to speak on is the question of U.S. foreign policy and what this means for U.S. foreign policy. And I'm not a foreign policy specialist, so I hope some others will speak up as well. But one of the things that I, from talking to many people in Washington and different branches of government, my sense is that there's this recognition that not talking to Muslim Brotherhood kinds of groups is going to be a problem. That this was a good thing to have dialogue with these different groups. Even in the 90s when I was in Jordan, living in Jordan and Yemen, doing my first book research, State Department officials would always ask me we would talk to them if we could. We can't, or we're not allowed to, or they won't talk to us, but we want to know what's going on. We want to have a dialogue because we recognize they have a significant constituency. So I don't think that we're not talking about Congress. Congress is another story. But I don't think the sort of, State Department analysts, people in Security Council and a number of these other agencies are thrilled with this repression of Islamists. I think they see from the history and from talking to them that this kind of repression and exclusion tends to come back to you, because when you shut down space for all kinds of alternatives, there's a very high likelihood that you'll get some kind of radical response. And so, but their hands are tied in some sense, and if that you're tied to the Sisi regime and to Saudi Arabia, then, where is the space to go to try to foster a dialogue and encourage the moderate side of this? The U.S. government is in no position, if it wanted to, it's not in a position to do that. Finally, I'll say that, most of this story is not a story about Islam. As we've mentioned, there are so many different views on it. Muslim Brotherhood could not hate ISIS more than they do. They hated the Taliban. I remember I've written about this, but when I was there in the 90s, they would say, the Muslim Brotherhood would be wearing suits and mustaches, and they would say, well, according to the Taliban, I'm not a good Muslim because I don't have a beard, or I'm not dressing up, I'm too Western looking. So they, from that point, had always sort of resisted the groups that they were seen as more extremists. And now ISIS is not something that's appealing to them. It's something like, oh, now we have to contend with this as well. And it's really sort of made the terrain difficult for them to put forward their own views. So I want to say in broad terms, it's not a story about Islam, but I don't want to go so far to say that it doesn't matter. I think it does matter because it continues to be a language for an alternative, a language of empowerment and an alternative to this repressive context, to this environment of foreign intervention. It continues to offer in very different ways some alternative possibilities, the way it has for decades. And I think that's out there, and we have to find a way to hold on to the thread of that and recognize that without landing on Islam says and Islam is this and it's all about Islam. We have to find that balance. But those who go so far as to say Islam is irrelevant, I think isn't quite right either. So I will end there, and I think we raised more questions than we answered perhaps.
Okay,
but
thank you.
That could be good.
Thank you all, panelists. I want to start off our discussion with a question that I think appeared in some fashion in all of your discussions. So, especially Dr. Nathan Brown, for example, said, made the analogy to the 1960s, in Washington, D.C., and how some Muslim Brotherhood members are behaving, acting like this in Istanbul right now. And other panelists also joined in similar arguments. So my question is Islam really not too much at the core of these parties? Are we looking into something else? Is Islam, my colleague Mohammed here would love it, is just instrumental for them. They are basically a very good example of anti-system parties. They want to change the system, but Islam is helpful on that front. They're very similar in that sense to, say, communist parties of Europe throughout the 20th century. How would you respond to this comment? What kind of a role does Islam play in all of this?
I will take a stab at it because nobody else will. But I know Mohammed Tabar's book in the making, so I've read it. I wouldn't go as far as he does. And the word instrumental goes too far. It implies some level of almost of insincerity. No, I think when I'm dealing with people in Islamist movements, I think I'm dealing with people who are very devout, very sincere, very, very pious. So it's not a matter for them of religion simply being a tool. The idiom in which they express themselves is often religious in nature. The arguments that they have with each other often sort of draw on religious argumentation in order to support their position. All that said, what I'm struck by is how it is that the debates within the Islamist camp, although often occurring within with sometimes a religious idiom, are fundamentally political discussions, fundamentally political judgments. How much do you trust the state? Who are our true adversaries? What are the possibilities for electoral participation? What are the possibilities for building some kind of alternative community outside that of the dominant society? Those are basically fundamentally political things which they disagree about. The mission, as I say, kind of increasing Islam in public life, is one that they take very, very seriously, and I think their devotion to Islam and to the Islamic Sharia is very, very serious. But so that's why I can't go as far as describing it instrumental. But I think I get a lot farther understanding these as political disputes than I do as religious ones.
Yeah, I would add, I think the political disputes, again, systematically goes much farther in answering questions about what the groups are doing. Having said that, just to echo a point I made earlier, there's a diverse range within the groups. And so I remember, and I think it was 96 or 97, the first female elected to the Shura Council in Jordan, Noel Faouri, has a PhD in English, and her children were grown up, so it was okay. She could play this role, and she studied Sharia. And she told me the first time she went to a meeting and wanted to talk about, Sharia, she's like, these guys don't know anything. They're like idiots. She's like, I'm trying to talk to them about, Islam, and they're just like, shut up and sit down. And so, there are people that are, very thoughtful and very principled, and, and we have dinner with them and spend Eid with them, and there's no doubting how important it is in their life, and they it's central, and they're really committed to it, and they think this is the right image. There's others in the party that are different, and then you get outside the leadership to the rank and file and to other followers. There's just not a single answer to what it means. It means different things to different people. For some, it's simply a language of local authenticity. Islam is from here, and we need, some solution for everything wrong, and why do we have to look to communism or capitalism or the West or socialism? We have it here. And that resonates when you look around and you say, our situation is horrible. We're looking to the wrong places for answers. And I think that, which we've heard for decades, but I think that still resonates for a lot of people. It's our solution, it's authentic to us. But there's no single answer for the place of Islam, even within the top leadership of the movement, let alone as you go out.
And I would add a few things. There are varying degrees for Muslims who are in politics. Okay, let me put it this way. Because if you're a Muslim and if you're a pious Muslim and you're in politics, does that make you an Islamist? It's not clear. And in AKP case, for instance, they called themselves in the beginning Muslim Democrats. They came to Washington. They said that we are Muslim Democrats. Actually, not even Muslim Democrats. They said we are conservative Democrats, which is kind of a troubling term, but still, and then Veli Nasr called them, you're Muslim Democrats. You're not conservative Democrats, all right? So that's great. And now they call themselves post-Islamist, whatever. And then now we are calling them political Islamists. Yes, a lot of people call AKP political Islamist. But then we have to make we have to distinguish these two. This is like, I think the example of religious right and religious left in the United States can help us. Okay, there's religious right and religious left. Both groups are religious, apparently, yes. One is in the left, one is in the right. What is the difference between the two? One is Democrat, one is Republican. Okay, I'm not going to go into more detail, all right? But you know the difference. So it's like that. In Turkey, let's say if AKP is using religious right argument, which they do, among other things, okay? It's a different animal. It can use a lot of arguments, okay? But occasionally they use religious right arguments. At some point of time, Erdogan even threw the abortion debate. It was unbelievable. There's no such debate in Turkey, all right? People discuss for a week, draw, examples from US and so on and so forth. It was just to shift the agenda for about something. Just throw it. And what about religious left? There hasn't been any religious left in Turkey, meaning that you're religious and you're after social welfare, all right, policies, and then you're not imposing your faith over others. This is not your priority. Priority is you're motivated by your religious beliefs to provide more to poor, to disadvantaged, and so on and so forth. There you have, this is more like, for example, Gülen movement in Turkey. That's more like religious left, all right? So now these two basically are kind of in fight with each other. It's like you're both religious. So if we approach with crude terms, oh, these are both Islamists, both Islams. They are the Muslims fighting each other, you know, power struggle and so on and so forth. We're missing a lot of things. So I mean, in conclusion, there are varying degrees, and is also the very important distinction between being a Muslim in politics and being an Islamist. For an Islamist, for example, there is no Muslim. Everybody needs to be Islamist. All right? If you want to be a good Muslim, you need to be an Islamist. You need to have an ideal, like Islamic State, whatever, blah, blah. You know, it all comes with a package. You cannot be a Muslim, because then if you're just a Muslim without asking all these things, then you're not a good Muslim. And that's what takes you to your discussion. There's no end to that. That's generated a lot of conflicts. 1,000 people dies every year just because of this question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Let me open up the floor for questions. We're running a little bit short on time. Yes.
Yes. Ambassador Jerejian started by expressing and quoting from the United States how the United States views its role in general in countries and specifically in the Middle East. And then we heard from you the different how this political Islam is sort of a disorganized organization in all those countries. And I heard the statement that Islam is seen with extreme suspicion by the current political establishment in the countries. So what I'm interested in knowing is how the political Islam views the role of the United States in the political Islam, in things that are happening in those countries.
Well, I can, speak to before the last few years. So the last couple of years, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question in the last couple of years. Prior to that, my experience with the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, the Islah Party in Yemen, which I know very well, I've been studying since the early 90s, were not thrilled with U.S. involvement because it was propping up regimes they didn't like and arms, et cetera. But there was a welcoming of like, if the U.S. is really going to push for democratic openings, that's going to benefit us. And one of the things you saw in Egypt was Muslim Brotherhood leaders didn't, they were quite willing to talk to U.S. officials once you were allowed to. There wasn't this, oh, we can't talk to them. There was quite a willingness to that. But I think there's a suspicion of, do they really mean it? The same suspicion they had towards their own governments, do they really mean it? But I always encountered a much more openness and, cautiousness, but an openness. Like, if they're really going to push for this, then okay. I don't know if your experience was different than that.
It's a bit of a complicated relationship between the West and Islamists, or how Islamists perceive the West, and in particular the United States. I think partly due to the fact that there's colonialism or colonial history and the association with that. And the U.S. is seen as not in the traditional sense of the term as a colonial power, but still having, wielding great influence in the region, so that naturally affects how Islamist parties perceive. In the case of AKP in Turkey, for example, a position on the United States or anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism is a pragmatic tool. When you need to, gain a little bit more votes, when it's a close election, you resort to these kinds of measures. You up the ante in terms of, the United States is the core problem in the Middle East, for example, or the West is the root of all evils. Even today, despite the fact in the past several years before 2010, the tension was relatively low in terms of United States or the West and AKP's discourse. So I think this has to do, there is a recognition that the United States the West wields a lot of influence in the region, and they can change a lot of, they can affect a lot of things. There is a recognition for that. But in general, because of the cool approach of the West to these Islamist parties, there's a discontentment with that, and also there is, I think, genuine displeasure with some of the policies on the ground, Western countries' policies on the ground. Think about the Iraqi wars, for example, or the state of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example. So those are really thorny issues for Islamist parties that they generally endorse, from the Muslim or Middle Eastern perspective. Yes.
So I have a question for Dr. Turkin. So you mentioned, Doctor, that the AKP's victory was kind of surprised for all of your analysis. I'm kind of surprised that you didn't see that, because we all knew that the AKP some kind of showed a really smooth kind of behavior with the Kurdish question in Turkey. They started peace negotiation with Kurds, with the PKK, and so they lost the election, and especially they lost the election in the Kurdish area with the HDP party. So they abandoned, for the next term, they abandoned the peace process, and they waged a war against PKK to gain support from Turkish nationalists, which they did, and they won. So do you think that, I think that's the only thing that I see that the AKP changed to gain extra votes for the next time?
They also won their Kurdish votes back. So you're pounding Kurds for about 3 months and you're getting Kurdish votes. That's hard to explain. So everybody was, look, AKP is top party in Turkey no matter what. But there are psychological thresholds. For example, if they go less than 40%, that's almost like losing, although they come on top, but it's losing for them. All right? So they themselves were expecting in the range of 40, 43, 45. 50%, that's 4.5 million more votes. Okay, that's significant. And that is we are surprised because Turkish constituents, Turkish voters at times surprise everyone, all right? They don't say their true feelings to pollsters, all right? They say, well, I may vote for this, but they don't, apparently. And the participation to election was much higher than last time, all right? And it's in that sense, it was surprising. Not that we are surprised that Turkish voters sometimes surprise everyone. That happens. Like every 3-4 elections, you get a very surprise. For example, 2002 elections when AKP first came to power. All right, AKP was a new party. All right, they didn't have an election experience, and then they got 35% of the votes. And the incumbent party got 1%, okay? That was like, I was a PhD student at the time. I was not following Turkish politics because it was very nasty at the time, all right? I just checked internet for the results. I couldn't believe my eyes. Nobody believed, okay? I was listening radio, to get the results. And the radio, the DJs were talking like, this cannot be true. There must be something wrong. What's happening? Is there going to be a coup d'etat tomorrow or something? They were talking like that, So such surprises happen. So we're kind of like surprised on a 5-point basis. That's what I'm saying.
Let me add that just a little bit. About 2 weeks, maybe 2.5 weeks before the elections, there was a big explosion. There was a big bombing in Ankara, in the capital. More than 100 people died and a few hundred people were injured. That was recorded as the biggest terror attack in the history of the country. I think that affected the psyche of a lot of voters in the sense that it wasn't so much, before the election, Erdogan asked for 400 deputies from the voters. And after June 7 elections, he repeated, if you gave, 400 deputies, we wouldn't have this violence, we wouldn't have this political tension and such. And then we had the bomb, in Ankara. I think a lot of people just said, just let let's get over with this. It wasn't so much that they liked AKP, perhaps they were in love with AKP or anything. But I mean, you have to think about the alternatives. So what's the alternative? The incapable CHP, or a very sort of Kurdish party HDP, which really doesn't appeal to the majority of the voters, or nationalist MHP, which is basically like a party that doesn't know anything other than no to all kinds of proposals. So it's like a 2-year-old, so to speak, throwing tantrums all around to any kind of proposition. So in that sense, AKP seemed the most logical, or reasonable choice, in the sense that establishing order, despite the fact that liberties, rights might decrease under his rule, but still it's better than hearing news of people dying every day on the streets.
My question is, with this victory, would you say that it consolidates Turkey as a regional power? And if that's the case, then I think it's a good thing, whether it's the AKP or...
Well, it consolidates the ruling party. They have been challenged in the last 3 years, starting with the Gezi protest. I'm sure you watch or heard about that. And then there were corruption investigations, a lot of opposition mobilization that happened in the last 2-3 years. So now they kind of stave all this away, all right? They have solid majority. They have this, they are sanctioned by the people. And so now they consolidate their power. But on the other hand, Turkey is facing great challenges. There's a Syrian crisis, which never ends, okay? There are over 2 million refugees in Turkey right now, some of sleeping in the streets and so on. They try to go to Europe, but most of them are in Turkey. And then the Kurdish issue, as my friend mentioned, there was a ceasefire before, and then after the elections, they used this as against stick, and then start to pound, Kurdish militants and so on. So when you do this, usually there's a response which may come anytime. Okay, so you polarize the society to win the elections. Okay, you're gonna pay one day. All right. So we don't know what will happen next in that respect. And then there are, economy is not as great as before. It's more like Turkey has been growing in the last decade and then start to basically spend from what they have, out of its pocket. Basically, there's no significant economic growth in the last 5 years. Per capita income didn't go up. Okay, it's kind of stagnated. So these are all concerning for a growing population, very young population, all right, and in a very challenging region.
Yes.
So right now all three is for all. So what was talked about is mostly like the groups, the parties, the establishments, the regimes. But where do you see like the people of those countries, like the general populations, where do their hearts lie in terms of what are they looking for? And do any of the Islamist parties or other parties actually meet those demands? Like, are they looking for a democratic yet religious, kind of like secular yet respectful to religion? Kind of like, what are they looking for? What would they vote for in an ideal country?
Good question. Anyone?
I'll try again. It's difficult. I'm going to draw on some themes that Julian mentioned before. What I would say is, if you take a look at public opinion polls, and there's now public opinion work that's of varying quality, but you certainly see high levels of religiosity. You often see kind of high levels of interest in democracy and so on. You sort of talk to people. You certainly hear an awful lot of sort of everyday kind of prosaic economic concerns. So it's hard to sum that up necessarily, or it's hard to sum that up as like they're looking for X. But I would take a step back from the question, what is it that ordinary people are looking for? And to me, one of the big lessons of the upheavals of 2011 is that I'm not sure these societies consist of a single group called ordinary people, right? These are much more diverse societies. The one that I focus most on, Egypt, thinks of itself as very homogeneous, and in some ways it is. You don't have strong linguistic differences. You've got 90% probably or more Muslim and so on. It's still a society that's very deeply divided geographically, by class, to some extent by level of religiosity and culture and this sort of things. And what strikes me when I look at the politics of these places is that because you've got very, very strong regimes, not only are most demands placed immediately towards the regime, but there's, again, as Jillian mentioned, there's very little space for political organization. So populations are not very well constructed to do normal politics if normal politics means articulating interests, various points of views, and competing and working them out with each other. Those kinds of horizontal linkages among the people and among different orientations just don't work very well. So in a sense, you've got political systems that I think are not all that answerable to the people, but are not constructed very well to get people who often disagree more than they used to realize in the past to come to agreement with each other.
Yes.
I have a question. With the new government in Turkey, would they partner with the United States and NATO now, just to balance Russian and Iranian influence in Eurasia?
Well, Turkey is NATO member already, so it has been since 50s. That relationship is very solid, so to speak, and you would hear some anti-Americanism in Turkish politics, especially during the election season. But that's more like as Kadir said, is a kind of like pragmatic discourse. And in reality, they are very close to the U.S. and they want to work together. I mean, that seems to be very important for Turkish leaders, political leaders, including AKP. To be invited to White House, to have a photo op with Obama, and so on. This is still very important. And in that respect, in terms of the strategic alliance, priorities have not changed. There were some mishaps. For example, U.S. and Turkey cooperated to fight against ISIS, and then they start the operations, but then they found out that Turkish jets were bombing the Kurds instead of ISIS, and then they said, all right, we're going to go back. So such things happened, and there are, but U.S. is also very careful nowadays because Turkey is a strong ally in the region, and this is now a tumultuous region. You have to fight against ISIS, and whom you're going to trust, all right? So because of that, for example, the administration is very timid about what's happening in Turkey politically, domestically. The rule of law, the freedoms, and so on, everything goes down the drain, and there's no reaction coming. Nothing is coming. Although Congress were vocal a few times. So in that respect, they want to work together. There are ups and downs in U.S.-Turkey relations all the time, but they stay together. Turkey is also very dependent on Russia, Russian energy, Iranian energy. But then the fact that Russia now came and settled in Syria, that's against Turkish interest because Turkey wants Assad to go and nobody to dominate, including Kurds. So they want to have some sort of like a friendly government in Syria, which is not happening. But still, Russian-Iranian alliance is not a good news for Turkey. So that bring U.S. and Turkey closer, ironically. So.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your time first. Several panelists have pointed to the Ankara bombing as fueling the AKP to victory, and just as you mentioned, the AKP is, or rather the Turkish military is currently supposedly fighting ISIS, yet ISIS has been blamed by the government for both the Ankara bombing and the Suruç bombing in June. And especially after the Ankara bombing, much of the local media was pointing to the government, calling them complacent and lacking in their ability to protect the people. How can we then point to the bombing as fueling, public support for the party?
Good question. That the answer is, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
The answer is about 80% control of the media. So despite the fact that all the security, sources and forces, information and investigation pointing to the fact that the two bombers were ISIS related, and they were actually in this suicide bomber to-be list, of the government of 20-some people. The government didn't take action against that. What happened is immediately after the bombing, the prime minister and other government officials and all the sort of pro-AKP media channels have come out and said, this is the business of PKK. And that, chorus continued well until the election, despite the very obvious fact on the ground that the two bombers were ISIS, affiliated. So people, according to a poll conducted a few days before the election by a Turkish company, about 50% or so of AKP supporters have identified PKK or HDP, its political affiliate, as the sort of perpetrator of the attack, whereas the rest of the general population said close to 38-40%, it's either PKK or HDP who undertook the attacks. This is just unbelievable. I mean, the extent of this almost propaganda, going on in the country through the media is just unbelievable. I think that's the main reason why a lot of people have come out behind the government. Yes.
Thank you. Professor Bilgin, earlier in your talk you mentioned something about the Turkish state's Oriental state structure. And I was wondering if all the panelists, as sort of scholars in the United States, speaking to an American audience, could reflect on, the idea of presenting this history to an American audience as well. And specifically, in this, it took till the end of Professor Schwiedler's talk to even bring up the United States, and we've now started to discuss colonialism and foreign policy a little bit in the Q&A, but I wonder if we forefront the imperial framework within all this is working, whether it's the, Professor Schwiedler also brought up, American recognition of how if we don't speak to these Islamists, we're not going to be able to cultivate certain different differences, et cetera, other political projects. What about the history of political projects in the Middle East that have been destroyed by the United States? So I just wonder if we could, practice a little empathy and humility and critique as scholars in the United States and think about, that framework.
And takers?
All right. Well, I can, as a person from the region, all right, I can tell you that when we speak of a particular state structure in the Middle East, which has been dominated by Ottoman Empire, until 1920s, so that we're talking, a top-down system, which was also a familiar system in Europe before the democratic movements, let's say up to 19th century or so, uncontrolled executive in the name of Sultan, or a Pasha, or a governor in the case of Egypt, and very militaristic state, which expands with military campaigns, all right, which basically prospers with military wins and defeats. Ottoman Empire expanded with military wins and then start to contract because of the losses, right? So So the sultans are commanders in chief, and then they kind of like the whole system goes down like that. And even Turkish religious structure, for example, is very militaristic. If you go to Turkey, the Turkish religious practice is very disciplined. The mosques are very disciplined, very clean. You know, they don't allow certain actions. In Arab countries, people are kind of frolic and play and so on and so forth. They don't allow this in Turkish mosques because it's the military thing, you know, coming from that. So we're talking about a strong state all the time, priority of state. There's the kind of like a sanctity of state. Okay, sanctity of state. So that's one thing probably will be hard to explain in American. Sanctity of the state. State comes. There is it's an abstract thing that you have to devote yourself, even die for it. And then, but there is also people, the populace, okay, who have been working, paying taxes, and so on. So, for instance, the last 100 years of Turkish politics is a history of between popular countries and the state establishment parties. All right. So these are this is the conflict that has been going on, and in the case of AKP, for example, took over against the state establishment, and it became itself the state establishment. So this system, the state culture that we're talking about, is so eminent, so dominant, so overwhelming that, you know, it just basically absorbs all other powers and then basically turns into, something like its own. And then, you know, you have to wait another now wave. So this is pretty much the situation. In that, I mean, it's not looking down on it, or it's not something like that, because a lot of people in Turkey are very much aware of the difference between autocracy or democracy. Even the simple voters, they know very well what they're doing, but it's a matter of preference at a specific time under specific circumstances.
Yes.
Yeah. It's, so I know we're getting the cut it off sign, but I think it's a really important question, and there's too much to say here, but I think unpacking that history and remembering it's really important. And the U.S. was involved in supporting the creation of the preeminent, monstrous Islamic state in the region, Saudi Arabia, of course, and continue to support this state, which has disciplinary mechanisms almost identical to those of ISIS, but of course it's a state we support. So I think we need to remember that history, and of course as much that could be said about particular movements as well. So thank you for raising that.
Okay. Thank you for our panelists. We have come to the end of our discussion, but we have a reception outside, so you're more than welcome to direct your questions individually to our speakers. Thank you. Yeah.